A couple of weeks ago, I talked about a historical attempt to form a community of European realms under a legally powerful parliament, much like the European Union of today, but all the way back in the 15th century. Today I will go over a treaty that was very similar, but more military alliance focused, rather than themed around the ideals of European community and shared prosperity. Much more like NATO and other major alliances, but during the peak of the Renaissance, rather than the Cold War. And also, this treaty, it got passed. The Treaty of London. This one, 1518, was what brought Europe, if only temporarily, together against the Ottoman threat. Constantinople had fallen, and the Ottoman threat was clearer than ever. Europe came together to discuss their plans. The story goes as follows. Thomas Wolsey was born in England, 1473, to humble origins. The man pushed through life and studied theology at Oxford, joined the Privy Council, took part in diplomatic affairs, rose the ranks, becoming one of King Henry VIII's most trusted advisors, being granted the title of Lord High Chancellor of England, whilst simultaneously being granted the rank of Cardinal by Pope Leo X, becoming the Archbishop of York. Meanwhile, on the geopolitical scale, you have two powers rising rapidly, France in Western Europe and the Ottomans in the East. These two powers threatened the balance of power in their local regions. Henry VIII was plotting the fall of this new, powerful France, and was making preparations to form a league of anti-French neighbours to dismantle them. In 1518, however, Henry changed his foreign policy, and with the help of Cardinal Wolsey, decided on a very different path. The argument was that such a humanist-inspired treaty would bring Henry more prestige than if he was to fight a very costly and arduous war against France. However, one could argue such a non-aggression pact would surround France, blocking their possible routes of expansion. Meanwhile, their neighbouring powers could build up internally and prepare for a later war instead, catching France off guard. That could, perhaps, have been the thought process. You have got to remember, with foreign policy, especially this far back, no one really knows the true thoughts behind these grand plans, what they publicly say they want, and what is whispered behind closed doors, only to be lost to history, are two completely different strategies. For other nations, however, it was a chance to temporarily forget the threat posed by France, and instead focus all attention onto the Ottoman Empire, for the greater good of Christendom. And so, gathered in London, organised by Cardinal Wolsey, were delegates from 20 different European realms. Of course, the Ottomans were not invited, but, fun fact, the Duchy of Muscovy was not invited either, as back then that was seen as more of Asia rather than Europe. The signatory states included England, France, Spain, Scotland, Denmark, Hungary, Portugal, Austria, Venice, Urbino, the Dukes of Cleves and Gelers, Florence, Ferrara, the Hanseatic League, the Swiss, the Dukes of Savoy, Gudrez, Mantua, Montferrat, Saluzzo, and the Pope. The treaty goes as follows. All signatory powers must agree to a non-aggression pact with the League. If any member of the League was attacked by a non-member, then all members must join sides and declare war on the attacker. And lastly, if any signatory power declared war on another signatory power, breaking the agreement, then that would also trigger the defensive clause, and the League would have to retaliate against the power in violation. Despite when King Henry VIII of England had a wrestling match and lost to Francis I, King of France, it went well. Henry gained his prestige, and it was a great personal victory for Cardinal Wolsey. But, most interestingly, it threw England into the spheres of European politics and diplomacy. England, as the organiser of such a treaty, became recognised as a great respected power in Europe. Sadly though, it only lasted 3 years, as in 1521 England joined into an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire and Spain to fight France in the Italian War of 1521 to 1526, where they won. Also, war broke out between Denmark and Sweden, so the treaty ultimately came to nothing in terms of anything long term. However, England's place in Europe as a broker of diplomacy became recognised, a role it would continue to play as often as it can, even to this day. Constantinople had fallen, and Muslim armies were sweeping across Europe, or at least that's how it would have been seen and often described. And that's important, to put yourselves in the shoes of them at the time, trying to ignore the advantages of hindsight. This was a new threat that was growing rapidly, a response to which only seems logical to possibly be rash, with little planning involved. Arguably, it was this rashness that resulted in its failure. It clearly showed no intention of being enforced or contracting any real plan to solve the Ottoman problem directly. At best, it was a publicity stunt. Cardinal Wolsey eventually fell out of favour with the king after failing to negotiate the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The cardinal lost his titles and was to stand trial for treason, a common punishment for failed officials during Henry VIII's reign. However, the cardinal would die of natural causes before he could even make it to the court. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed and learnt something. Leave a like if you did and subscribe to get notified of more. Also, please share with anyone you think may be interested. It really helps me out. But for now, until the next one, this has been the history of diplomacy.